declare that carried. Thank you. That takes us to item 7, which is extraordinary items, and none have been notified. So we proceed now with we're going to item 8. Members, just by way of introduction, at today's meeting we're considering several pieces of government reform relating to urban growth and housing and our responses to those reforms. Today's agenda is another reminder of how quickly reform is moving and is needed. It's also a reminder of the critical work we must undertake to arrest the housing crisis. And broadly speaking, this means that as a council, we'll be working a lot more closely with central government. We're not going to be doing this alone, either party, central government or ourselves. It's going to have to be a concerted, collaborative effort. To set the scene now, we'll go to item 8. And the first substantive item at 8 is on the agenda, and that'll be our monitoring and progress report on the Auckland Plan outcomes and the challenges inherent in that document as well. So we're now on item 8, and before us we've got Denise O'Shannessy and Karen Kirk. Now I think I'm going to hand to Karen. Karen Kirk is our Principal Strategic Advisor, who keeps a very close eye on the Auckland Plan 2050 monitoring. In your hands, Karen.
Tēnā koutou katoa. So yes, as we know, the Auckland Plan was adopted in 2018, and it sets the long-term strategic direction for growth and development in Auckland in accordance with the outcomes we want to achieve. This is an annual report, and it uses 33 measures basically to track general progress and trends across the Auckland Plan's 6 outcomes. And I'd like to acknowledge the outcome leads that are here today. We can answer questions after the presentation, but we may have to refer to the outcome leads as subject matter experts. They've all contributed to the report. This is an important report from our point of view, tracking progress against the outcomes, so as we can identify any potential areas for improvement or areas for further work, and that can help inform decision making on the annual budgetary process, but also the long-term planning process in 3 years' time. The report uses mainly data from 2020, so it captures the impacts of COVID in some instances, such as quality of life, public transport patronage and unemployment levels. If we move on to the next slide. This just gives an overview of how we're tracking. The majority of measures either show positive change or no significant change. But we also have a number of new measures, and these were adopted by Planning Committee earlier in the year in relation to the Environment and Cultural Heritage outcome. And in those instances, we have baseline data now, but we'll have to look to the future to track progress. So that's why there's no change there. In terms of key points emerging from the report, in terms of belonging and participation, quality of life remains high. It's actually increased since 2018, but we are seeing an increase in the proportion of Aucklanders reporting a decline in the previous 12 months. Basically, it's gone from 13% in 2018 to 30% in 2020. And people actually mentioned the impacts of COVID in relation to their comments. We've also, we have new data this year in relation to whānau wellbeing. We don't have a trend yet, but 73% of Auckland's Maori rated their whānau wellbeing positively. However, we are seeing a decline in the proportion of Maori youth in employment, education and training in 2020. We're seeing a positive trend, but it's dropped slightly in 2020, possibly in response to COVID. We're also seeing a continued increase in the number of new dwellings consented and completed, and multi-unit dwellings comprise most new dwellings consented now. And also, unemployment rate for March 2021 increased slightly. However, on most of the economic measures, it's not as bad as was predicted, and we're beginning to see the economy recover in response to the impacts of COVID. Public transport boardings, again, had been increasing, but we saw a decline from 103 million to 61 million in 2020, again, as patronage has been impacted by COVID-related lockdowns, but also critical renewals on the rail network. And air quality had been improving. However, our greenhouse gas emissions for 2018 still remain higher than 2016 emissions. And we're also seeing recent changes to the unitary plan have seen an increase in the number of sites of significance to Maori scheduled. In terms of next steps, some of our measures, we're going to do a bit more work. We still need to find a more appropriate measure of Maori participation in decision making, because our number of co-governance measure hasn't really changed in the last couple of years. But also we're going to look at some of the transport measures. We were using model data, but when we have real-time data, we can use that instead. And as we've heard from the previous presentations, we're looking at a number of changes at the national and regional level in relation to emissions and ecosystem health, and we'll begin to see the development of new measures in that space as well. And we also need a better measure of digital connectivity and internet use, especially in light of COVID. We'll also be doing some further refinement of the homelessness measure, noting that Ministry of Housing and Urban Development are carrying out a lot of work in this area. But in terms of reporting next steps, you can expect a development strategy annual monitoring report end of October. Of course, we'll come back this time next year with the next annual monitoring report, and we also carry out a more in-depth analysis looking at a wider range of measures in March 2023 to help inform the next LTP process, or perhaps earlier. So the report is for noting progress and receiving the report, and we can then go ahead and publish it on our website. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Karen. Thank you for that presentation, and thanks for the report that is on our agenda. I think there's going to be a range of questions here, Karen and Denise, starting with Councillor Henderson, please.
Thanks, Chair. Two questions, and thank you for your report, by the way. It just provides a brilliant picture for Aucklanders on how their city's tracking and really important measures, so well done for your work. First question is, looking at paragraph 19, the Māori outcomes stats, a decline for Māori rangatahi in employment, education or training from 82.2% to 76.8%. That's a scary one. Do we have a figure on how this is tracking for non-Māori?
Yes, we do. An important point to note is a lot of these measures report at the regional level. It's a snapshot in time, but obviously that we could carry out further analysis. It doesn't look at the impact on specific groups or more detailed information at the local board level, but that's an example of further analysis that we can undertake.
Thank you very much. We'll follow that one up. The second question I have, Chair, directing councillors to page 29 of our agenda regarding accessibility for jobs. Now, forgive me, this makes me pretty angry reading this. 33.9% of jobs accessible within 30 minutes by car. That's a third. 9.8% of jobs within 45 minutes by public transport. Do we have any steer on how that compares worldwide and what would be realistic as a target for Aucklanders?
I don't think we do have that information. It may well be something that we cover in the 3-yearly deep dive. However, that is something we should be looking at. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one question from me. When I read this report, I was rather surprised to read under Homes and Places the monitoring on housing costs as a percentage of household income, and it's according to the measures, there's no significant change. But we're all aware of the growing challenge of unaffordability in housing. And we're aware that there's recent record of the median price for housing continuing to grow at an alarming rate, some 22 to 25% over the last year. I'm hearing this morning CoreLogic reporting 1.8% growth in the median price in the month just gone. That's June. I think it was over 2% in May. And the median residential sale price in Auckland is now approaching or possibly past 1.2 million. Yet I read here, I'm trying to reconcile that other evidence with your monitoring. I think we need to give you the opportunity to expand upon the report as it's written under Homes and Places, point 3.
Through the chair, yes, it does sound counterintuitive. The measure is about, as you pointed out, it measures the ratio of housing costs to disposable income. So while housing costs have gone up, incomes have also gone up. Also, the data includes all households, including those who have potentially paid off mortgages, so their household costs are a lot less. But it does hide or mask the figures around particular groups who are more impacted. So certain types of households, such as renters, are spending a higher proportion of their costs. And also for Maori households have 15% less income than non-Maori income households. So we're still seeing inequality there. So it's a figure which masks the impacts on different groups.
So if there is a masking, do we need to refine that measure so that we can look at it and get a better understanding? Because it's a little bit too easy to look at no significant change and move to the next chapter or the next measure. I'm concerned that, well, question to you, do we have the right, are we asking the right question there? Have we got the right measure in place, or do we need to review it?
So we can certainly have a look whether there's a better measure. We can also add more commentary into the report to explain the differences. So rather than just with that one bald figure, we could include more information which might be helpful. But on an ongoing basis, it's important for us to review those measures and see if there are better data sources.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Casey, please.
Oh, thanks, Karen. I love to hear your voice. In reference to paragraph 16 of your report about job losses and displacement of workers, there is no mention of the effect of COVID-19 on women, especially women in employment. And I just wondered if in future presentations you could give us some gender analysis.
Yes, we actually did carry out some gender analysis and we can provide that. Surprisingly, most of the data that we looked at, it hasn't impacted on women more than men significantly. And we've checked this with our colleagues in the Economist unit. But yes, we can provide that analysis. Again, that's an example of intuitively, we would expect to see more change. But again, I suspect it will be on different groups and possibly at a sub-regional level. But we can certainly include that.
Thank you, Councillor Casey. And Councillor Dalton.
Thank you. Just picking up on Councillor Casey's question, I had met with CSI, who were TSI, and they did find that women were impacted more by job losses, so that would be more of a sub-regional I'm interested in that information too. My question, you made a comment around measuring outcomes for Maori, and that maybe we need to have a look at how we're measuring, and that's a conversation we've had in a lot of different places. I wondered if you put any thought into what that might look like, and a couple of examples. One was around how we measure the responses on our long-term plan our consultations in general, and how Maori are always featuring low, and how we're capturing the written word, whereas actually the conversations and the feedback are coming face to face, and how we capture that, and we might find that we have a larger response, and also that sometimes a consultation is at a hapu level, and that's representing more people. There's that one bit, but then there's also about how we're measuring the work that we're doing through policy and impacting change for Māori, and have we got that measure right, and should we be consulting more with Māori on how we measure, so we're not doing the statistics I get, the facts are the facts, but there's a whole lot of other things we're measuring here that are not statistical. So has there been any thought into what that might look like as a council approach?
Yes, we've been working very closely with our colleagues in Ngā Matarai. They're obviously developing their Māori outcomes measuring framework. And a lot of the measures that they've come up are complementary to our measures. For example, they're looking at, it's an existing measure, percentage of Māori residents that can participate in Auckland Council decision making. But yes, it has been challenging trying to capture good information related to the quality of engagement with Māori. And it's certainly something very close to my heart, because I was responsible for Māori engagement in the Auckland plan. And yes, it was more capturing those relationships and the quality of conversations. It's definitely challenging, and we'll continue to search for better measures. In terms of impact on policy, Denise is probably best placed to talk to that point.
Yes, I mean, as Karen said, we're continuing to work to develop measures which are more effective. We obviously, through our guidance we give on strategy and policy development, we are encouraging people leading those projects to think carefully about alternative methods of engagement or things that are more appropriate. So we continue to do those sorts of things and provide that guidance. But the measures are something that we will just review as we go on and find better ways to do that.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. Councillor Coombe, your question.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Tēnā koroa. Thanks for the report. Can you just remind me, so there's two sort of parts to my question. First of all, just clarification. When the Auckland plan was refreshed and minted, there was a political working group was going to be set up to look at more substantive targets, particularly around transport, and that didn't progress. So we don't have those targets in the plan, for example, like mode shift. Is that right? Have I remembered that correctly? And can you just remind me why we didn't progress with those targets?
Yes, you do remember that correctly. We didn't progress with those targets because we did do some initial work with our central government colleagues to look at if there are any ways to arrive at those shared targets. So that was the resolution, was that there may be an opportunity to agree targets with central government that may or may not sit with inside the plan. So a decision was made at that point that it was best to use other processes, strategy te tarakea, tāwhare, water strategy, other processes to set those targets rather than include them in the Auckland plan.
Thank you. Which kind of goes to the second part of my question, is that I'm concerned that our targets that we're having in different documents are not aligning. So I just want to understand what is the process that you see that we're going to have aligned targets? For example, the RLTP has different targets to the recovery budget that aren't aligned with Te Tarukia Tawhiri, and we're now going to also be doing a emissions reduction plan, which presumably will have new targets as well. So how are we going to bring these into alignment, and who's going to be monitoring them, and who's going to be advising us on how they can be brought together? So we're all working towards the same thing.
That's a good question. I think it's part of the process as that new work's happening, that and it should be a consideration of that alignment. Ultimately, the targets are a decision for council, but in the advice that comes to you, it should include consideration of where those targets might deviate from targets that have been set through other processes. So that would be an important part of the advice that comes forward.
Thank you. Maybe, Mr. Chair, there's a need to get it on the work program for the planning committee, so we know at what point we're going to all know that we've got our targets aligned, so that also going into the annual plan next year, we can ensure that those measures and targets are not out of sync like the ones we signed off the other day.
Okay, I'm just getting my head around what you're saying there. You're referring to the targets. This is about the 33 measures, and you're looking for an alignment between the measures and the targets. That's what you're saying.
There's measures, but they don't have committed targets. That was the intention originally, that there would be targets within the Auckland plan. Then they were going to be worked on elsewhere and aligned with government targets. That bit of work hasn't happened. And now we're getting to the situation where we don't have a cross view across all of our various plans that mean we have the same measure and the same target, and particularly around transport. So a big issue is we don't have a meaningful target for, say, mode shift, for reduction in VKT, and for changes to, like there's a whole lot of targets that we could have for transport. So I just want to know that that bit of work is going to be picked up and we know who's doing it, and it's going to be brought back to us, because I think that will need to be refreshed in the Auckland plan, not the Auckland plan, the annual plan next year.
Okay, got it. Let's leave it there for the Chief of Strategy and Megan and Jacques Victor Karen to consider. We've already mentioned this possibility of some refinement on some measures. We'll consider that question of alignment between measures, targets. We'll pick that up. Thank you. Member Leanne Namani. Kia ora, Leanne. Leanne, are you with us?
Kia ora. Yes, I am.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Kia ora. I just have a couple of questions. Firstly, I do recall, just with my involvement in the Auckland Plan development, that there were still measures that were going to be required, Māori measures in other outcome areas. And I'm just wondering if that's being prioritised so that, or ideally, I guess, next year, we have those measures final. I just wondered what the progress is on those.
Yes, we do have Māori measures sitting within the other outcome areas, and I mentioned one of them, which was number of Māori young people in employment, education and training. There's also one in the belonging participation area, which is more Aucklanders' awareness of the treaty and their understanding. Unfortunately, the resident survey didn't go ahead last year as a result of COVID and the impacts of COVID. So we don't have new data on that. However, we did have new data on whānau wellbeing and also te reo use. And we've included baseline data in this report, and we'll be tracking progress in future years. And obviously the point I mentioned before, that our measures are quite high level, but they're intended to sit alongside and complement the Māori outcomes monitoring framework by Ngā Matarai.
Kapai, it was very good to see that there are 2 new measures around the whānau wellbeing and te reo. So in your view, the Māori outcome measures as relates to the Auckland plan have been completed? Are across all outcome areas and I guess to your satisfaction at this stage?
Well, we have 4 Maori identity and wellbeing measures, which is quite a small number. We're always looking to find better measures. So at the moment we've identified further work around the Maori decision-making measure, because we haven't seen the number of co-governance arrangements, which is our proxy, increase. And also, we don't find that a particularly satisfactory measure of Maori participation in decision-making.
Kapai, following on, and it is a question around that measure. So the reason it has been put to the side is because you don't think it's a good measure?
It is a good measure. It just hasn't changed in the last couple of years. So now we're thinking, do we need a more effective measure of Māori engagement or Māori participation in decision making?
Could it be how we're measuring it rather than the measure itself?
Yes, that's a very good point, because we have...
Because I just look at earlier this week, the amazing housing development partnered with Ockham and Marutuahu, and I'm sure council had a role in, enabling that. And I guess it's just a question I raise. That it could well be how you're measuring it.
Yes, absolutely, and we have had conversations with the co-governance team, and they raised that point as well. Again, counting numbers is all very well, but there's a desire to kind of capture the quality of these arrangements. So yes, absolutely, I think that should be part of what we explore going forward in relation to that measure.
Could I just add a point too in terms of the earlier question, that the report that we do on a 3-yearly basis draws on a much wider range of data in terms of increasing the number of measures, Māori measures across all of the outcomes. So that paints a broader picture than this annual scorecard.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Namani. I'll now go to the question of Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Chair, and tēnā kōrua, ladies. Look, as a result of the Southern Initiative changing its focus and direction, who is monitoring and delivering on the TSI 1 6 priorities and also on the Southern Initiative's focus? Do you know who's delivering on that?
Through the chair, I don't know. What we're reporting on are the 33 measures in the annual scorecard. So we're not including any other measures other than those 33. But I'm assuming that the CSI are reporting.
Well, sorry, Chair. They actually report to the PACE committee, but the fact that there's a change in direction, I'm still trying to find out who is delivering on the 6 priorities that were set up in the Auckland plan that set up the TSI and also the focus areas. I don't know. I'm assuming that maybe the CCOs may well be delivering, but I think it's important. I know they're now under cloud ears, but this is in regards to the monitoring, and I think it's important that that monitoring is also done. If it's going to continue to come to the planning committee, Yes, they report to the PACE committee, but the monitoring of our tracking with the 6 priorities and focus area stays with this committee, Chair. So that's why I'm asking that particular question. Thank you.
I'll pass to the Chief of Strategy for comment, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Kia ora, Councillor. I understand the conversations and thoughts you've been having on this for a wee while, and you've spoken to me, so I get it. Let's work on it. Yeah.
Yeah, look, if we can, it's been a year and a half and the steering group having met, but I'm going to get that steering group up and running because at the moment we're everything in the Auckland plan, Chair, that came through is not being achieved through the TSI, but through the CCOs, which therefore then things need to be re-looked at. But this is the question I posed because the monitoring is still through your committee. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Filipino. I appreciate you alerting us to that, and we will follow up. Now go to Councillor Walker, please.
Sure. I've just got some questions around measures, and the context of my questions are all around the Council's adopted climate emergency. Okay, repeat that, climate emergency. So, yes, it is really good to have the measure around Auckland's carbon emissions, which have been tracking up and continue to track up. And I just emphasise my questions around measures are around quantitative measures where possible rather than qualitative. So is it possible to have a measure around waste that includes not just domestic waste but commercial and industrial waste, because they are by far and away the larger quantitative amount of waste and they are measured each year by council? Is it possible to have a measure of the amount, the length of streams across the region? It's a physical length and the loss of streams each year. Is it possible to have a measure, a quantitative measurement around the loss of the number of significant trees each year in the region? Is it possible to have a measure each year around sea level rise? And we know, for example, recently that it was 7 mils a year in Littleton. In the not too distant future, we'll probably be measuring that around centimetres a year, and obviously that's significant, that's sea level rise, that's quantitative. Is it possible to have a measurement around soil loss, particularly elite soil loss across the region? And is it possible to have a measure around the number of homes subject to flooding that goes to inundation, and that is a quantitative measure that we already have. So what I'm asking, Mr Chair, is given that we have a number of quantitative measures that we measure, so these are existing measurements that we have, can we not include them, particularly in the context of the climate emergency, which the Auckland Plan obviously has some reference to? Thank you.
I'll go to Denise. We did consider, when we established the measures, we canvassed this conversation of how many measures did we want, and you're proposing to increase it by 50%. So, yeah, it's always possible, but there's a question of, there's a lot of questions. So, Denise, can you just remind us, when we confirmed these measures, we went through a pretty thorough process and quite a wide-ranging discussion on what to really narrow down to, what was really important, and then knowing that other information was available as well. Can you just remind us of that process and also to respond to Councillor Walker's question of that possibility?
Yes, so as you say, there was a quite a comprehensive process, and bearing in mind the context, as you're aware, of the state of the environment reporting, which is the very in-depth reporting on the environment, we selected a small number of measures across each outcome to track progress on an annual basis. Over the last couple of years, we have been aware that we needed to improve the measures in the environment and cultural heritage outcome, and we came to you in April to propose an amended set of measures for that outcome. We also go more widely, as I mentioned earlier, when we report on a 3-yearly basis. we draw data from a wider range of sources. We are always open to looking at other measures which we think might be more effective, so we can certainly do that, but we actually draw on a lot of that data already in our reporting, not necessarily in the annual scorecard.
And just a follow-on question, Mr. Chair. Given that Auckland is a city, and there are a large number of other cities that report on measures, and for example, we used to be a member of ICLEI, a Sustainable Cities group that has identified various reporting measures for cities. Do we actively look at the opportunity to benchmark ourselves with other cities, looking at the measures that they have, so that Aucklanders can make comparisons between how they're tracking with other cities? And the reason that I'm asking that question, Mr. Chair, is a lot of our measures are qualitative and some of them may be unique to us, and yes, that's relevant, but obviously it's how we're benchmarking against, say, Barcelona or Vienna and other leading cities, particularly in the climate space, is really important. So just a question there.
Thank you. Denise?
We don't, for the purposes of this report, we don't do that benchmarking process.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
But we do it elsewhere. It doesn't mean to say we're not doing it. Is that correct? We are looking at other international cities within New Zealand. We're looking, and we've got a research and monitoring unit that's looking at a lot of things.
That's correct, yes. So through other processes that occurs, but for this purpose, we just report on those measures. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Goff, your question, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to Denise and Karen. There's a real goldmine of information here, actually. I've got 500 questions, but I'm going to restrict them, Mr. Chair, you'll be pleased to know, to 3. The first is on homes and places, and it's got a chart here on page 42, housing costs as a percentage of household income, and it's almost counterintuitive. It suggests that from 2017 through to 2020, housing costs have actually remained reasonably stable as a percentage of household income. And I think the general perception is, well, certainly the perception of house prices is that they've gone up, although they did even out over some of that period. And the perception is that house prices, including rentals, have been going up quite substantially. So, I'm not challenging your statistics, but I'm trying to marry the difference between that perception and what you're showing on that chart.
Denise?
So the measure is, as you say, about the ratio of housing cost to household income. It doesn't seem to line up with what's been reported. The reason for that is that incomes have also been rising at the same time as housing costs. So the ratio of that hasn't necessarily changed, but that data does include all households. So it includes those whose housing costs are not as high as many others. So when you actually delve deeper into the numbers, there are definitely certain types of households and certain groups for whom housing costs have risen significantly.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, this suggests that for most people, their housing costs are, 23% of their household income, which would generally be regarded as relatively affordable. But within that, you'll have people paying 50, 60% of their household incomes.
Right, yeah.
So I don't know whether we've got an ability to break that down to make it a bit more meaningful, but that might be something you could consider for the future.
I think we can do that.
Thanks. The second question I've got is under transport and access, and it's on page 60, and it's the deaths and serious injuries, which shows a rapid rise from 2014 to 2017 and a very significant decrease from 2017 to 2020. Now, it's one thing to know the trend, but the even more important thing would be to know, how do you account for those trends? What caused the significant upswing in deaths and serious injuries, and what's led to a significant decrease in those things? I'd like to say it was, new policies that we'd implemented, but I'm not that rash as to suggest that. There must be a variety of factors, but do we have a breakdown that would enable us to disaggregate those figures as to potential causes?
So because the plan was adopted in 2018, we've been working from the 2018 baseline in terms of saying it's a positive trend from 2017 through to 2020. The drop in the 12 months to the end of December 2020. COVID.
Yeah.
But really, I guess the important point will be a year from here, understanding what change there has been since then. So whether that trend, the positive trend continues. What we do have actually is a breakdown in terms of the road users who have been impacted most. So we have actually got some more information on that.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be really important because we're investing a hell of a lot of money in road safety, and we need to measure what impact that has, disaggregating it from other factors such as maybe increase in kilometres travelled.
Right.
So I don't know whether you can get beneath those figures and try to find what accounts for those trends. These are Auckland figures, but I don't know even how they might match up against national figures, but it would be really important if we had a better understanding of what causes the DSIs to go up and what causes them to come down. So maybe if you could think about that. Mr. Chair, my last question is on a new measure that you've implemented, which is the number of native trees planted by Auckland Council. And this is the first year, and you've got quite an impressive figure of the 475,000 trees planted, which is kind of in line with our target of 1.5 million trees over those 3 years. But for those, so we simply don't know what happened before this year, though, in terms of what we were doing. Do we have anything to compare that number against? That's page 70.
Yeah,
It just says it's the first time it's been measured, but I just wondered, I don't know whether that's I'm presuming that's a significant increase in the past, but is there any way of being able to tell that?
I can't answer that question, but we can go away and check that and come back to you on that.
That'd be really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. And Councillor Sayers, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was around the measure called Auckland Health under Belonging and Participation, Measure 5. And that seems to be that we go out and we do a survey and we ask Aucklanders, how they're feeling in mental health and general health. But I wonder if we might be missing something, Mr. Chair, in terms of perhaps some of the presentations we've heard today, that with housing, as households need more people living in them, particularly Pacifica households, probably twice the number of infectious diseases amongst their children in those crowded environments than even Maori. So I wonder if we should be having a report around infectious diseases and crowded environments in those sectors. It might be something that we're missing in terms of, if there is overcrowding, what is the implications in Aucklanders' health as a result of that? And I think it's pretty well documented that it's those diseases, and particularly infectious ones amongst the children. So I'm sure that might be available through medical avenues rather than us going out and surveying people. It might be a bit cheaper to access as well. And I just wouldn't mind that considered for inclusion, Mr. Chair, and any comment that the officers might have around it.
Well, there's most certainly overcrowding, and we can work, Denise, we could work with the District Health Board, boards, plural, Ministry of Health. They collect that data. There's possibly other ministries as well, and the Research Information Monitoring Unit does work with those agencies, I believe, on a regular basis. So we could pull together that information. Anything further to add there, Denise?
No, nothing further to add.
Okay, we'll take that on board. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Bartley, please. I don't think your microphone is operating. Would you like to swap to the next one?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to ask the same question as the Mayor, but he already asked it regarding affordability and 23%, because that's concerning. It's not what I see in my community, absolutely not. So really would appreciate a breakdown of that figure. So instead I'll ask a question about the sense of community in neighbourhoods. Any commentary around, I would have assumed that there'd be a peak given the lockdown and COVID, but no?
Yes, that was one that I was interested in as well. That there hasn't been any change from 2018. It's still around 50%. But again, that's at the regional level. REMU are developing the Auckland specific quality of life report, which will come out at the end of July, and they'll be looking into differences at the local level. But also across different groups, different ethnic groups. So yes, very much looking forward to seeing those differences.
And if I could ask one more question, please, Chair. You know, we're really strong about saying no to racism. How are we kind of tracking that in terms of belonging and participation through this, aside from it being a measure about the tiriti or waitangi?
Although it's not a measure, it's not one of the 33 measures. This was an issue that was raised by Councillor Casey when we reported last year. So as a result, we included a new set of questions in the Quality of Life survey related to discrimination and racism. So we've just got those results that have come through now, and it gives us an insight into people's experiences across different groups, and also down to the local level. So again, that will be in the July report from REMU.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bartley. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and that's a great report. The Mayor's absolutely right. This is the gold mine of information here. The one I'm interested about is the opportunity and prosperity in particular. And it shows that we're increasing yet the GDP per household, per job, full-time job. Yet as a productivity mix, New Zealand has sort of plummeted down the OECD rankings to 44th from being in the single fingers category 15 years ago. So that must presume that although we are rising, it's not rising as a comparator to other nations.
Through the chair, so yes, it's not comparative to other nations. It's simply reporting our GDP.
Yes, yep. That's sort of interesting because we were beside Ireland, and now Ireland's 14th and we're 44th.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. I think we've exhausted the questions, and there's a thirsting for more information, which is good. But as the Mayor said, it's an absolute gold mine before us, and there's other parts of this council that have got more information. It just doesn't all fit in one report. But one area that does intrigue me, and maybe it's within our research and monitoring unit, or it could be from academics at the university or government agencies, is there any research into the impact of skyrocketing house prices in Auckland and the impact that's had on centres close to us or other destinations, Whangarei, Hamilton, Tauranga, possibly even Nelson, as Aucklanders don't see a future here because of the housing crisis. They can't buy, they can't rent, they go to another centre, or they capitalise here at those high prices and then impact the prices in other centres. Has government or anybody, ourselves, have we undertaken any evidence-based research in this area?
As part of last year's three-yearly deep dive, we looked at population movements, people moving out of Auckland as a result of house price pressures is one of the factors. And we drew on some research that was carried out or commissioned by Treasury. But no, the type of in-depth research that you're proposing, as far as I know, hasn't been carried out. So yes, that's an idea.
Look, we won't resolve that now. We just consider that, and maybe we discuss it with the university. It could be a research paper or something like that. Okay, we'll leave that now. There's no further questions. Is there any comment to be made, Councillor Henderson? We're in debate now. So thank you, staff, Denise and Karen. Would I have a mover, please? In Councillor Henderson, yes, and a seconder in Councillor Casey. So it's moved and seconded. The motion's before us. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you, Chair. There's 2 points that I want to make just briefly, and sorry, Chair.
Sorry, and thank you. Thank you for the report and your response to the questions here today. You're welcome to leave the table, please. Thank you.
Yeah, look, and I do just want to firstly acknowledge our hard-working planning staff for their excellent report and the treasure trove of information that we have before us. And we'd love new measures, but the fact is, the more work we load onto our planning staff, that needs more resources. And so when we're looking at budget, this is one of the moments we might want to think about. But secondly, and in more of a fulsome way, I want to just point out, look, we do need to set targets for job accessibility. I think that data is really, really scary. We have great staff at Council and Auckland Unlimited that can actually work on this if we tell them to. So we need some targets here. I want to acknowledge the Manarewa High School students that talked about accessibility of public transport earlier today. That's routes and that's affordability as well. Evidence is beginning to show that we have some of the most expensive public transport fares in the world for outer areas of the city. These are the very people that need it the most to access work. So we're talking about a large majority of Aucklanders that live in outer Auckland. We expect to shift from the car to public transport. We ask them to pay through the nose for it. And we say that there's poor access for most of those areas. And when you overcome these obstacles, many of them have to travel great distances for their work in the first place, and that alone has impacts on their family and their well-being. So 9.8% of jobs accessible within 45 minutes of public transport is completely unacceptable. This needs to be significantly improved, and we need targets in place for better public transport and more jobs in suburban Auckland. Thanks, Chair.
Good, thank you. Councillor Walker.
Just a comment, Mr. Chair. I just make the observation that there are a number of measurables that do not involve any work on the part of officers because we're already doing them. If we're not doing them, the government is doing them, and they are absolutely pertinent. I think there's a need for a refresh. We have a climate emergency, and this report is quite deficient in a number of areas that go to that are directly relevant. So I think there's a need to refresh. I put up some suggestions, for example, and I think that related to that, it is essential that we benchmark ourselves with other cities internationally increasingly, because then Aucklanders have got an opportunity to see how we're measuring up with Sydney, Barcelona and the like, rather than other cities in New Zealand. And with respect, what we're putting out doesn't enable anyone to actually do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And Councillor Casey. No, okay. I don't have any other speak. Councillor Newman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's interesting looking at this report and then reading things like the article in the newspaper today about the comparatively low rates of take-up of the COVID-19 vaccination by Maori. It's interesting to reflect on the strategic direction with respect to the Auckland Plan and how we're benchmarking against that when we know the palpable differences between funding between local boards. Chair, you asked the question about what research exists about Aucklanders cashing up their capital gains and then moving to centres outside of Auckland, which, I think a lot of Aucklanders will do, and they'll do it because they want to live in a location that's affordable and enjoy their capital gains, not so obstructed by congestion and what have you. I think that this is an interesting report, but I think it only tells us some information. It doesn't explain everything. It explains some things. But the truth is, Chair, that Councillor Henderson's absolutely right. And I'm so tired of sitting around having debates about extending greater service levels and new services and improved services to people who have the most choice and the greatest amenity when we don't tackle the hard stuff around communities that don't have public transport services. And we don't tackle that because it's too bloody hard. It's too expensive to do that. Auckland Transport tells us, well, we have to make choices and funding is limited. Well, you know what? That limited funding tends to go to those communities that already have the services, which just exacerbates the differences between those who have and those who don't. So I want to thank the authors for this report. But the truth is staring us in the face, actually, about some of the decisions that are taken around this table, which exacerbate it, which exacerbate the differences, which are not easily resolved, and which entrench some of the inequalities, which is completely contradictory to the principle of the Auckland Plan, which is about equity. There won't be equity of outcome. I accept that, but it would be nice to think that we could make a deliberate decision as a matter of policy intervention to address some of the gaps that exist, not because it's the easy thing to do, but because it's necessary to do it. And I look forward to some of that discussion when it comes to whether we need to protect some of these heritage overlays later in the agenda.
Thank you. And I think finally, Mayor Goff.
Yeah, just looking at the homes and places section of the graphs that they've set out, and if you look at that on page 37, you just see a massive increase in housing consents. So we're now consenting more in 1 year than we were doing it 4 years at the beginning of that comparative from 2009. But just to mention to councillors that the latest figures are just out on building consents in the last year, 18,565. That's a 28% increase on last year. This time last year, we were calculating they'd probably decline with COVID. They've gone up by 28%. And if there is this massive movement of people outside of Auckland to cheaper housing, I want to know why we're consenting around about half of all the houses being built in the country at the present time. There's no indicator for me here that Auckland is becoming a less popular place to live. For some, it's becoming a more expensive place to live. But you'd also have to believe that unless we are getting the overwhelming bulk of New Zealanders coming back to New Zealand living in Auckland, we should be making decent inroads into the long-term housing shortage problem that we've faced in the city. But it would be quite good to dig into those statistics. But we have never, in our history, not even in the halcyon years of the early 1970s, been building houses in Auckland at the rate that we're currently building them. And if supply and demand ever means anything, you would think that that would have to result in the medium term in a levelling off of those house prices together with the government actions. But we certainly hope so, because after congestion, that housing cost and housing shortage problem is obviously the biggest one we have.
Thank you, Mayor. It is moved by Councillor Henderson. It's seconded by Councillor Casey. We have the motions before us, so I'll put those now. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no, and declare that carried. So members, we'll leave that item. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back to the next item. So we'll come back at just a fraction after 12.